Yo, we are back. Ghostface Gaming. It's been a while. We gonna finish this out. I got a new lightsaber, y'all. That slavery truly was ordained by God to give birth to the best of all possible societies. Southerners didn't understand why they needed to justify something that had happened since time began. And the only kind of we listened to a documentary about the Mississippi War today. I'm gonna give y'all a few minutes, maybe about an hour. I'm gonna go catch this bus really quick. Take care of some business. Throughout the early part of the 19th century, the divisive issue of slavery finally the Louisa the Jedi Temple. Y'all, check me out.
Abolitionism was a campaign to end slavery and set slaves free. It was a movement back in the 1600s. Religious groups condemned slavery as unchristian. They were
Oh.
this idea
Well, you don't.
that wasn't the case at all. They were a small. While there were a growing number of rationalist thinkers that criticized slavery for violating the rights of man, in the political arena of the 1860s, Southern Democrats endorsed slavery. The cotton-growing economy of their slave-owning constituents were dependent on it, especially in Mississippi. The slave doesn't need the master needs the slave. And so slave owners believed the very opposite, that slaves needed them. A slave doesn't need a master. But a master has to, the only way he can be a master is to depend on a slave. At the time, the majority of the Republican Party leaned the way of the abolitionist movement. And in the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln was the presidential candidate for the Republican Party. As a result, his name appeared on the ballots of 10 southern states, including
here, buddy.
What this next to is the political power that a politician in a slaveholding state has. Not a single vote.
Can you get him? I'll get after him.
I think
Jedi's wait.
the kind of political power were the men who were running southern states. And these were the senators, the governors, these were the mayors of large towns. These were the people who owned slave markets. And so not only did they have economic wealth, but they also wielded a lot of political clout.
Lincoln's nomination took place about 2 weeks before adjournment. The intelligence came like a thunderbolt. Members from the South purchased long-range guns to take home with them. The unthinking among them rejoiced that the end was in sight, but those who considered more deeply were dismayed by the prospect. Mississippi Congressman Reuben Davis on the nomination of Abraham Lincoln.
In many ways, they made Lincoln out to be more of an abolitionist than he actually was. Lincoln and the Republicans campaigned on a platform that would have limited slavery's expansion into the Western territories. But Lincoln and the vast majority of his party had no desire to interfere with slavery where it already existed. But to many Southern politicians, he really did seem like kind of boogeyman, I suppose. Wealthy plantation owners feared that if Lincoln was elected president, that it was just a matter of time before he abolished slavery. They didn't want to. Many fortunes were lost 3 years ago during the first worldwide economic crisis, the financial panic of 1857. Wealthy Southerners were afraid that if Lincoln became enslaved, it would cause yet another financial disaster. Mississippi was built on the backs of cotton. Economy was built on the backs of thousands, tens of thousands of black people who picked this, what they called white gold in the 19th century. It would have decimated.
It would be an
economic gain on the South to have to give up their slaves. But Lincoln offered to reimburse slave owners. And, free the slaves. We'll pay you for the labor you've lost. But nobody was interested in that.
They're not necessarily interested in compromising with Lincoln at this point. It's a slap in the face to their way of life. They don't want to give up their slaves.
The die was cast. The die for secession was cast in Mississippi. The election for president in November of 1860.
Abraham Lincoln was elected the President of the United States.
Here.
Democrat Stephen A. Douglas, Southern Democrat John C. Breckinridge, and new Constitutional Union candidate John Bell.
We'll end this
All
quick.
anti-slavery states of the North,
already.
as well as the western states of California and Oregon. No ballots were cast for him in 10 of the 15 southern slave states where his name did not appear.
Lincoln was elected by Northern voters. He did not even appear on the ballot in many southern states. He didn't appear on the ballot in Mississippi. For many Southerners, this signaled a kind of sea change, that in the future, the North could elect a president without having the support of Southern voters. The South essentially had become a political minority in the country and was an increasingly weak minority.
The rights of states to govern themselves, threats to secede, and arguments justifying secession from the United States.
I remember the wonder of these
were
caves.
part of American
Well, I couldn't
politics
wait to complete my
almost
training and become a Jedi Knight.
In 1860, Jefferson Davis was Mississippi's long-standing senator in Washington. He believed that the states were small and should be allowed to lead,
Might escape. Take him out.
but he was also aware that the South was ill-prepared militarily, and so he argued against secession. He wrote,
I worked
He's
tonight.
too scared.
Well,
You, end him.
but I knew North was mad, blind, would not let us cover our show.
Stay on you.
So the war came.
Hurry, catch him.
The South was beginning to lose its power in the legislature, and they could see the writing on the wall. So by the time we get down to 1861, Mississippi opts to follow South Carolina out of the Union and to secede.
Wisdom dictates that all the questions arising out of the institution of slavery should be settled now. Mississippi, Jacob Thomas.
when Lincoln was elected, John Pettus, a wealthy Kemper County planter, was Mississippi's governor.
He was part
Hi,
of a
BD.
group of pro-slavery extremists known
Hey,
as
BD.
fire eaters because it was said that they would rather eat fire than sit down with a Yankee abolitionist.
Governor John Pettus was a man who was very much in favor of secession. Thanks to his leadership, his charisma, his strength of character, he would help sway members of the legislature and among the civilian population to vote for an ordinance of secession.
As a governor, Pettus was in many ways pretty pathetic. He was very opposed to staying in the Union under any circumstances. The fire eaters had sprung up in South Carolina. There were a lot of them later in Georgia. Pettus was probably the leading one in Mississippi.
Governor Pettus said from the beginning that if Lincoln were elected president of the United States, he would immediately call a secession convention and Mississippi would leave the Union. It was that clear cut. He was probably the most drastic secessionist that we had in the state. He really wanted to begin the war before secession. He did not want to compromise in any way that Mississippi stayed in the Union as long as the North would not compromise on the issue of slavery.
Target is mobile. Watch him. Could be a trap.
Even before Lincoln was elected, Pettus called for a secession convention. and brought together delegates from every county in Mississippi where they argued for or against secession.
Not all Mississippi people know about secession as Governor Pettis fiery. Let's remember, only a few Mississippians own slaves.
Those who had been long desirous for a pretext for secession now boldly advocated their sentiments and joyfully hailed the election of Mr. Lincoln as affording that pretext. The conservative men were filled with gloom. Secession they regarded as fraught with all the evils of Pandora's box, and that war, famine, pestilence, and moral and physical desolation would follow in its train. Mississippi Unionist Reverend John Hill Augie.
So this rush to leave the Union was not unanimous by any means. And two, you have to figure in patriotism. Mississippians and other Southerners, they, after all, were products of the Revolutionary War. The Union had grown out of that war, so they felt ties to the Union. Many of them had been educated in the North, especially the wealthier classes. So this was not an easy thing to convince people.
There were strong Union pockets in the state of Mississippi. For instance, when the secession convention was called to Jackson, several counties sent 2 delegations to represent. One side of the county would represent the secessionist movement, the other part of the county represented the anti-secessionists.
Tishomingo County, which at the time was a very large county, sent 4 pro-Union delegates to Governor Pettis' convention.
Their lives here were tied to railroad commerce, interstate commerce. There wasn't a lot to gain by separating from them.
Be mindful of your
And they're sent down to that convention specifically. They're not ready to leave the Union yet. They want to wait and see what's going to happen. They voted against secession.
Those people lived in hilly country. They didn't have plantations. They didn't grow cotton. So they didn't have any slaves. Also, there was South Mississippi, central South Mississippi, because there were not concentrations of slaves down there. There were not plantations.
Jones County did not produce that much cotton. It had the smallest slave population of any county in Mississippi. When the secession convention came in 1860, Jones County elected a delegate who ran on a platform opposing secession.
Not every Mississippian was interested in secession. In fact, the ironic thing about Mississippi secession is that some of the larger slaveholders along the Mississippi River were opposed to secession because they worried about the impact that the loss of slavery would have if a war came and the war did not go the way they would have liked it to.
Something nearby.
To stay in the Union and maintain
We're too
control
much for 'em.
that way.
Engaging.
Pittsburgh, ironically, matches 2 areas that depended heavily on river traffic. Were not anxious
Keep your eyes
to see
open.
because they knew what it was going to do to their business.
The 2 largest cities in the state of Mississippi voted against secession, but as the bulk of the rest of the state voted in favor of
Please. You and me.
here in Warren County and
Watch
County.
it. Fight us, you coward.
The real argument
Get the
not
hell.
Mississippi would leave the Union. That much seems to have been certain. The question was, should Mississippi secede immediately,
On it.
regardless of what other states did? Because remember, at this point, only South Carolina had seceded. So, did Mississippi want to go out onto this very dangerous branch alone? Or did they want to wait for other states to secede?
But those arguing for secession would not wait and put a lot of pressure on those who were pro-Union.
When it became apparent that the rest of the counties wanted to secede, they had a second vote, and many delegates changed their vote to have a bold front Mississippi. Everybody is in agreement.
On January 9, 1861, Mississippi's secession convention voted 84 to 15 to leave the Union.
The vote itself is a lot closer than most people believe today. There would be a lively debate in newspapers, town halls across the state of Mississippi. Not everyone was in favor of secession.
After the news broke that the Ordinance of Secession had passed, the Natchez Courier reported,
The secession ordinance was received yesterday with almost unanimous disapproval and condemnation. Hasty, ill-judged, wrong were the terms generally applied to it. Our citizens generally felt that the convention had sacrificed everything and obtained nothing.
Days later, on January 21st, 1861, Mississippi's Senator Jefferson Davis resigned from the United States Senate, a day that he called
The saddest day of my life. It has been a conviction of pressing necessity. It has been a belief that we are to be deprived of the Union of the rights which our fathers bequeathed to us, which has brought Mississippi into her present position.
Pettus made Davis a major general of the Army of Mississippi. Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas soon followed the example set by South Carolina and Mississippi, and they too seceded from the Union. These 7 cotton-growing states came together and formed the Confederate States of America on February 4th, 1861. And on February 9th, they made Jefferson Davis the provisional president of the Confederate States of America.
There, up there. I got it. Keep on it. Oh no, now he looks mad. Killing everyone. Watch him. He's not invincible. Get him. We actually won? Really?
Their whole argument for secession was that they felt that they were losing their freedom, their rights, the power to self-govern themselves. Many Mississippians, as well as other Southerners, felt that they had the right to secede and govern themselves any way they saw fit.
We're saying, well, they're trying to pick on us. They're going to invade us. They're going to, they're forcing us to do what they want us to do. People who lived in the South back in those days were, I don't know that that's ever completely gone away, but, you ask me about something and I'll work with you. You tell me you're going to do something whether I like it or not, then you may get some resistance.
States' rights was a political theory that Southern states used to defend the institution of slavery. It was used to justify secession. But secession itself was driven by the desire to defend the institution of slavery. When Mississippi seceded in 1861, the delegates of the secession convention stated that our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world.
So the battle from the start was all about slavery. There's been some states' rights, of course, among some latter-day historians that have been injected, but it was really about slavery and the secession revolution in Mississippi in January 1861.
Have a good reason.
It says so in simple words, history is about slavery.
Mississippi's Ordinance of Secession.
Utter subjugation awaits us in the Union if we should consent longer to remain in it. It is not a matter of choice, but of necessity. We must either submit to degradation and loss of property with more millions of lives, or we must secede from the Union framed by our fathers to secure
I think he's trying to run.
every other species of property for far less than this.
In a way, it's ironic that the argument that they were making was that they were against enslavement, not by a family nation, but enslavement by the laws and will of the United States of America.
Many Mississippians who desired the freedom to self-govern themselves denied that very freedom over half the state's population. Liberty and freedom were foreign concepts for many enslaved. Born into a life of subjugation, they had never experienced freedom. The enslaved lived out their lives under constant constraints.
You have to ask just to be mobile. You can't choose your mate without your owner's permission. You're not free. If you're pulled away from the community that you know, and let's say you're sold 2 or 3 times, where are you going to run? You know what the consequences of running away are. You can't run away. The risks just weren't worth it. And so you would just hope. Many of them prayed for freedom.
The new provisional Confederate president, Jefferson Davis, issued a call for 100,000 men from the various states' militias to defend the newly formed Confederacy.
He began to remove U.S. government presence from within the Confederate boundaries. This called for Confederate troops to start taking possession of U.S. courts, custom houses, post offices, inns, basically all the federal buildings, most notably arsenals and forts.
After Confederate troops attacked and took control of Fort Sumter, Lincoln called up 75,000 Union troops to reoccupy U.S. properties throughout the South. Thus began the Civil War.
It is now near midnight, and the excitement is beginning to abate. The battle house and telegraph office have been thronged for hours.
Buddy, help!
Speeches were made by many prominent Southerners. In the distance, I hear revelry and shouts of applause from the gallant Beauregard and the Southern Confederates. Unidentified member of the Vicksburg Artillery, upon hearing of the firing of Fort Sumter.
Watch my back.
Soldiers
I
like
can't fight anymore.
going on the war. They thought this
Keep formation.
honor and come back home and marry that pretty girl they'd always wanted to marry.
Needs a break.
Be a hero. They never really stopped thought about the blood and guts. Being blown apart.
Maybe we should go take a look.
That never crossed
Get him.
until it was too late. And I really got
Pressing on the enemy.
pride
No retreating. Stay on him.
because everybody
Get him already.
deserved it. Nobody had anything to do with it anymore. They were kind of caught up.
Trivial opposition.
Hard
Requesting maintenance.
movement. And once it caught fire, it just kind of spread.
You're lighting up Imperial channels. They're sending everything they've got at you.
Are you in Greece safe?
No, we fall.
We're laying low, but the
Battling
storm's
for our
clear.
rights and are determined to have them or
What
die.
about disguising the Mantis' signal?
That
Private
trick only
Robert
works
A.
if they're not expecting it.
17th
I
Mississippi.
have another idea.
Doing all right, BD? Good to hear.
Here in Mississippi, Magnolia State would send her bravest and most noble sons to the conflict. Men of prominence such as Earl Van Dorn, William Barksdale, and Jefferson Davis would be quick to respond to the call of the state. Tens of thousands of these Mississippians would die on the fields of battle, reaching all the way from Pennsylvania to the Mississippi River and beyond.
Mississippi's brave sons marched into battle in faraway places, at Bull Run, at Port Royal, and off the coast of Norfolk. But as the war dragged on, the battlefields grew closer and closer home.
Shiloh fought on April 6th and 7th of 1862 would be the bloodiest battle ever fought on the North American continent up to that date. The battlefield at Shiloh, just a few miles north of the state line with Mississippi, would be a bloodbath in which thousands upon thousands of soldiers north and south fell on the battle, including many Mississippians.
Each path is different, young one. Be mindful of your anger.
The brutal two-day battle produced over 23,000 casualties. A tragic irony, considering the name, for Shiloh means place of peace.
Union victory at
I
Shiloh,
sliced through their encryption.
April of
I'm
1860,
scrambling transmissions, but it won't be long before they're
North
restored.
Mississippi
Hopefully
to
it'll buy us some time.
invasion.
Thank
Very
you.
shortly
There's
after the
stormtroopers
action,
everywhere.
Shiloh Union
Ilum
forces
was our
pushed
planet,
into
Ken.
Magnolia
Don't
State.
let them forget that.
Mississippians feared the possibility, the threat of invasion of Northern forces. This might encourage slaves to rebel. With slave owners gone, with their sons gone, with overseers gone, it left women, young men, old men in charge of the plantations, and they were afraid that these people would be unable to control the South's large slave population.
For black people who are living on plantations and slave communities, masters and their sons are now okay. And so there's a change in terms of the hierarchy on plantations, right? You now have to listen to
Block not anticipated.
many enslaved people don't. They become
Taking the shot.
important.
He's
And
wounded.
that's why Mississippians, and in some ways, they were
Steady.
uncovered.
Concentrate fire.
And over half of the population
Help me, BD.
was enslaved. How stable was that?
He's hurting.
How would
On
the
fire.
slaves react to
He's
their
too quick.
masters leaving? How would they react to the arrival of Northern forces? And right from the beginning of the war, there were
Pursuing intruder.
of slave insurrections throughout the state, and those rumors became more frequent as the war progressed and as Northern forces actually began moving into Mississippi.
The invasion of Mississippi began in May of 1862, with the Union Army seizing control of the rail junction at Corinth.
In Corinth, you have the intersection of north, south, and east-west rail lines. It was referred to at that point in time as perhaps the most strategic city in the Confederacy due to those rail connections. With the fall of Corinth, the focus of military operations truly centered on the fortress city of Vicksburg. At the end of 1862 and into 1863, Union land and naval forces will operate against what was known as
Below us.
the Gulf of
Full shot returned.
the city of Vicksburg.
Unproductive human. Valueless. Integrity compromised.
Target is mobile.
The war fought one
Confirmed strike.
atmosphere that had an impact on the way the war was going to go and the way the war resulted.
Contact on target.
But experienced war
Help me,
first
BD.
see the horde of war
taking point on this pursuit.
all the way from Ship Island on the Gulf Coast to Corinth, north
Up here.
Iuka, Meridian,
Using stims. Watch him.
Vicksburg on the west. The entire state
Hit the target.
Inferior Jedi.
wars, major engagements, and minor actions were fought.
You will regret that.
By war,
Controlled
the
operation.
state was pretty much left desolate.
Nobody in their right mind praised war. The wealthy Southern cotton growers didn't want war. They had hoped that the great desire for mighty King Cotton would prevent war. That didn't happen.
People are just afraid. There are just a number of things that are
Throw me
happening.
a stem, bud.
It's being decimated.
Wow, that's
Are
better.
the communities that suffering both black and white are living through. In Mississippi, there's great death and sickness. People are hungry.
Despite the abundance of rich
They've
agricultural
broken
land,
through and called reinforcements.
the
Every
state
Star
could
Destroyer
not
in the sector is on their way
rely on
here.
imported
If they
food
get here
from
before you do.
the
No,
West.
we didn't come all this way to get captured.
So when the war began,
I'll be there.
Mississippi had to transition from a state that produced cotton to a state that could essentially sustain itself. That was very, very difficult because in 1862, Mississippi was hit by a drought. So there were crop failures throughout the state.
I myself have seen in Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Mississippi hundreds and thousands of women and children fleeing from your armies and desperados, hungry and with bleeding feet. In Memphis, Vicksburg, and Mississippi, we fed thousands and thousands of the families of rebel soldiers left on our hands, and whom we could not Star. General William Tecumseh Sherman, United States Army.
There were real problems with food shortages. Now, those problems were made even worse by the military campaigns fought in Mississippi. The Gulf Coast fell very early in the war, which made salt.
See here. We've got company. Tell Grease to close the mantis.
Couldn't
What?
preserve
With the Empire on your
war.
tail? Are you
Grant's
crazy, kid?
campaigns against
Trust me.
Vicksburg with his
We
army
do.
marched
We'll
through the
close the ship.
Delta. It tore up many of the levees in the Delta, which made flooding more common and made that much of that land unsuitable for agriculture in the short term. So the military campaigns were tearing up the state's infrastructure, which added to things
I'm glad
like
you're here,
drought
BB.
and the absence of so many men from the home front. It was very, very difficult for the people of Mississippi to feed themselves.
A few farms managed to grow enough crops to get by, but other places, like the besieged city of Vicksburg, faced rampant starvation, and under those conditions, disease can spread rapidly.
Disease, or the amoeba, which was the great decimator of the armies. That's where the great grim reaper of death really decimated the armies. These boys, they gathered together. They went off confident they were just going to meet a foe on the battlefield and laugh at each other and keep being heroes. Little did they realize that all of these boys were targeted from all of these different groups now of disease. Yes, roughly 80% of the boys were born.
You have all kinds of illnesses that manifest themselves physically, but also emotionally, psychologically. You also have strikes that are happening. The Confederate currency doesn't much because of the rate of inflation.
Mississippi was suffering from rampant inflation. Money was quickly losing value. There was a breakdown in local government. State government had to flee Jackson.
When that began to happen, faith in government officials began to fade away. It became apparent that the government of Mississippi would be pretty impotent in trying to carry on the business of the state, especially after the invasion of Mississippi began.
I'm gonna shoot him.
Chaos reigned in some parts of Mississippi during
You can't escape
the war.
us.
There was a breakdown in law and order. Counties were overrun with deserters, paroled prisoners, men who simply wanted to avoid conscription.
Better hurry,
Mississippi,
otherwise you'll never get promoted.
a lot of them,
Very funny.
there would be pockets of resistance throughout, not just in Mississippi, but all across the South.
Not long after the Battle of Shiloh, on April 16, 1862, Jefferson Davis enacted the very first American military draft.
The draft was incredibly unpopular. To many Southerners, especially people who accepted the states' rights ideology or the states' rights doctrine, it seemed as if they had replaced one tyrannical national government with another.
Under the Conscription Act, all healthy free men between the ages of 18 and 35 had to sign up for a 3-year tour of duty. Unless you owned 20 or more slaves and could afford to hire a substitute to take your place. If you were wealthy enough, you could choose not to go.
For poor people, people who didn't own 20 slaves, it seemed as if they were fighting to protect somebody else's property, that they were being asked to bear a disproportionate burden. People understood what caused the war, and now the people who had the most to gain from the war were exempting themselves from military service. They believed this made the war into a rich man's war and a poor man's fight.
The war came on, people started dying. It really didn't matter who was shot down on the battlefield, whether it was a big guy, slave, or one of the guys, or white men that we don't know yet.
still selling blood being spilled, counted in the fact the war itself still direct cause. Nobody Nobody had nobody Mississippi suffered devastating human losses during the Civil War. Approximately 78,000 served in the military. Of that number, about 27,000 were killed or died. 1/4 of the white male population over the age of 50 in Mississippi was dead. An entire generation was dead.
More than 620,000 soldiers north and south died on the field of battle or from disease. The cost of this war in terms of human life and their history.
On July 4th, 1863, Vicksburg, the great Gibraltar of the Confederacy, fell after a 47-day. Union forces took control of the Mississippi River, effectively splitting the Confederacy.
Vicksburg was really the turning point, not just in Mississippi, but the western theater of the Civil War. And I would argue even in the Civil War altogether. After Vicksburg surrendered, there were a lot of people in Mississippi that recognized the wrong. The loss of Vicksburg took the army control of
Confederate General-in-Chief Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant on April 6, 1865. 6 days later, Southern sympathizer John Wilkes Booth assassinated President Abraham Lincoln. Today, Lincoln is considered one of the most beloved of all American presidents. But that wasn't the case during the Civil War. Lincoln was so hated during his presidency that he received well over 10,000 death threats.
as a governor. Pettis is very confident. But we know the early war. It's now passes. He really becomes less relevant. He was just broken better, and just get the game, kill the enemies. The war began to come to
Right here, buddy.
really not much he could do to stop it. Pettis took the money to those flights. Absolutely. But he was convinced that he could single out for a special placement, maybe for execution. But he was captured. So he fled Arkansas, across the Mississippi River, and swamp in Arkansas Delta, and lived as a fugitive there. He died buried in a cornfield there. The result is that Pettis' last day somewhere along the grave was lost as the cause of so gallant.
As the body of President Lincoln was being laid to rest in the Oak Ridge Cemetery of Springfield, Illinois, Confederate Lieutenant General Richard Taylor surrendered all remaining rebel forces in Mississippi to Major General Edward Canby. It was May 4, 1865. The Civil War was at an end, but in many ways, Mississippi's true struggle was just beginning.
Reconstruction was an attempt to make sure that the former slave, now free, would become part of Southern society, become part of American society. But as you know, there was all sorts of violence in Mississippi and other places in the South where individuals tried to keep blacks not enslaved, because you couldn't enslave any longer, but keep them down, keep them suppressed.
White Southerners are about the laws of the Civil War. So those properly, they all the lives of families. So this is Parts of it have and so I think quite naturally there's a lot of in black people and northern different of the downfall of this civilization.
Did slavery cause the Civil War? Yes, slavery did cause the war. Why people fought is an altogether different issue. Some of them did not own slaves. Many of them did not own slaves.
Unproductive human.
Hit him already. I can get him.
Some
Watch yourself.
Unessential.
states,
After him. Pow.
Union soldiers wanted to preserve the Union. They didn't
Attack him.
like
Can't overpower us.
back
No.
extremely angry when the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect January 1 of 1863. A lot of Union soldiers were furious.
The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by President Abraham Lincoln, was not a statute enacted by Congress. It was a presidential proclamation. Lincoln told his cabinet that he had used his powers as commander-in-chief to free the slaves in the Confederate States because it was a covenant with God.
The Emancipation Proclamation brings the institution of slavery to the forefront. There is no way that you can now state that the war doesn't deal with slavery because the Emancipation Proclamation, in fact, makes slavery an issue. And it really changes the focus of the war.
Once they realized what this war was about, they rushed to march to Union presence in the South with the Civil War. Runaway slaves gravitated to that area, not only for protection of the Union forces, but also
Lincoln wrote the Emancipation Proclamation due to the fact that the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 required the return of runaway slaves to their owners. But Union generals refused to do so and declared the runaways contraband of war.
you start seeing a large influx of runaway slaves after the siege of Corinth, when the Union begins to occupy this area. Runaway slaves begin to first drift in here singly in pairs and then large numbers.
In order to house the numerous runaways at Corinth, the Union troops set up a refugee or contraband camp.
In a short period of time, the Corinth contraband camp becomes a model camp throughout the country. This is the way all contraband camps will be.
Which is interesting, right? The state that becomes the richest state in the Union because of slavery also houses the largest Corinth, Mississippi. And so for the year and a half that it's in existence, it has upwards of about 6,000 people. It really becomes a model country. And I think it's important for Black people to prove their humanity, to show that they can do more than slavery. People tend to think of those who enslaved as living a
We need a stim, BD.
And yes, it was oppressive, it was brutal, but I think what's really important, particularly in a state like Mississippi that had the largest population of people of African descent, see the cultural legacies that the state suffered, all the way from the culinary cuisine that enslaved people helped to give food, but also the ways in which people worship. I have in the worst and oppressive kinds of environment. And I think it's a real testament to this.
Southerners, by and large, lost a lot of their land taxed during this time of Union occupation. You see a large influx of Northerners coming down. Later, they'll be called carpetbaggers, folks that are looking to make a few bucks. People were coming into Mississippi from other parts of the South, places in the North, but they were coming to take advantage of the cotton trade. And realizing the potential, bought up a lot of these plantations and then created a new slavery for white and black by low pay. Okay, you're free to go, you can come and go, you're free to go. You got to take care of your own medicine. You got to take care of your own food. You can live on the place. I provide a company store on the plantation. Now the company store had all kind of beautiful little items and trinkets and jams and jellies, pies, and all kind of stuff in there which you could buy on bread. So the freedmen, white and black, worked on the fields and got so.
Let's get real. All we want is a great TV. A TV like this one. The 2011 movie In Time is set in a sci-fi dystopia where instead of money, time is the world's primary currency. People stop aging at 25, and when the clock on their arms reaches 0, they die. What if this world was closer to reality than fiction? This is Unveiled, and today we're answering the extraordinary question, what if time was currency? Are you a fiend for facts? Are you constantly curious? Then why not subscribe to Unveiled for more clips like this one and ring the bell for more fascinating content? First, we
Your
have
odds of surviving are low.
worked out how
Very low.
the function of the same content. Money was one of the earliest systems of trading and
Integrity compromised.
commodities. Thousands of years before a goat farmer might trade some of your goat's milk for the paper if it's so. Of course,
Still
not every
resisting?
uses
Unwind.
trading, which is why we need money as goats. We've had money and trade for significantly longer than we have the current economic system of capitalism, which is 500 years old and the longest is 200 years old.
Attack him quickly!
The revolution in European colonialism led to
Scanners failing.
the economic system that now leads the world. Modern currency in the form of physical or digital money really only works because everybody agrees to it. Most countries have abandoned
Inferior Jedi.
cryptocurrency has no physical equivalent at all. The value of money is generally arbitrary and tied entirely to demand. It's so arbitrary that many countries have made the mistake of trying to simply print more money to pay off their debts, causing hyperinflation. The most famous cases of hyperinflation were seen in Weimar Germany in the 1920s, where people were forced to take wheelbarrows full of money just to buy bread, and in modern Zimbabwe, where you can get single notes worth hundreds of billions of Zimbabwean dollars. The printing of new money has to be very closely regulated in order to keep inflation within a reasonable limit, with wages and prices rising to ensure things generally stay the same. But would we have to worry about any of this at all if our primary goods was time itself?
You
Well,
will regret that.
we're getting time. Time is notoriously
Analytical swing.
we know time passes, and that it only passes in one direction. We know it's the fourth dimension of space-time as described by Einstein, and that we only have a certain amount of time before we inevitably die. We also know, thanks to Einstein, that time is relative. For example, a clock moving away from an observer would be measured to tick more slowly than a clock within their inertial frame of reference. Once these clocks were brought together into the same inertial frame, they would have fallen out of sync. Time can also start and stop. There was neither time nor space in the singularity before the Big Bang. If the universe one day contracts into a big crunch, the same will hold true again. There are also singularities within our own universe. Black holes, bizarre points of space-time where the laws of physics break down. So it's difficult to imagine there being a source of time that could be exploited in the way that you can mine or, say, gold. Human beings do finite amount of time to live, however, but without being able to see it, we can't predict how much time each person has left. We could solve this by mastering time travel, okay? But we have to master traveling both forward and backwards through time to report results. However, going backwards in time would involve moving faster than the speed of light, and many physicists believe that this is impossible. It might also generate strange paradoxes. Then again, these paradoxes would also be taken as evidence to support the idea that time travel is impossible. But even supposing that we did find a way to time travel, building a database of life expectancies would involve sending people into the future just to write down when people die, and then traveling back in time to submit their data. This seems like far too much effort to go to just for the sake of producing an alternate currency, and there still wouldn't be a way to change how much time people have. You'd just have created creepy death counters for everybody. It's also highly questionable whether people would want to know how much life they had left. While it might prod us to live our lives to the fullest, it would also create a dark cloud over everything we did. Sometimes ignorance is bliss. A more feasible method to enforce a time-based currency would be by first mastering life and death and immortality. If you could find a way to keep people eternally young and then implement a literal time bomb that would kill them if they let their clock reach zero, then monetize time without having to redesign the entire universe. The promise of immortality and eternity might be enticing enough to get people to buy into time. This won't be an FTP, or such a system might be imposed on them by force, by some hypothetical dictatorial overlords. Bizarrely, there is a precedent for humans creating a time-based currency, albeit without the fatal consequences for in-time's character. From the 19th century on, a number of socialists have run experiments that implement quote-unquote time-based currencies where people earn credit for the amount of time they work. This isn't the same as just working for an hourly wage in standard employment, and the idea has developed into the modern concept of time banking. Time banking is a labor model based on reciprocity and where someone would offer a service to their employer and get another service in return, different from simply volunteering to help. And strange as this is, when time-based currencies have been trialed in these small experiments, it's all based on the idea that time is already currency. We're all born with a certain amount of time, and we use that time to perform tasks, such as working, in return for money. And generally, people on lower incomes do more demanding jobs for longer hours and less pay. It's a popular video for a reason, and that reason is that for every
Yeah, I
hour
can't do
you
it
work,
right now.
you create wealth and value for the company you work for, even if you work for yourself. Given that richer people can often have higher life expectancies